there's a root problem that's gone wrong in America. What would you say is kind of the heart of the American crisis?
Joe Biden used to talk of restoring the soul of America. Never said what it was. What's the soul? President Trump talks about make America great again, but he never mentions what made America great in the first place. In other words, it's become a campaign speech slogan, and I just don't think it's true. Very few presidents give you the real State of the Union.
The state of the American Union is in a more serious condition than most Americans recognize, and it requires urgent, life-saving attention. Our guest today spoke these words in his latest book, America Agonistis. Social critic Os Guinness is back to assess the state of the American Union at its 250th anniversary and consider whether America is doomed and why everyone, and in particular Christians, should care. Dr. Guinness, thanks for coming back on the show.
Always a pleasure, Sean. Thank you.
Well, I want to get your reactions to these stark words that are in your book, again, about the American Union being in a more serious condition than most Americans realize, and that it requires urgent life-saving attention. What do you mean by that?
Well, I said that in the context of the repeated statement in every State of the Union, the State of the Union is strong. You know, whether a president is a Democrat like Joe Biden or a Republican like Donald Trump, they always say that. And I just don't think it's true. In other words, it's become a campaign speech slogan, but very few presidents try and give you the real State of the Union. And while that's a congressional requirement for a president, I think it should be a concern for every American citizen. So as you approach your 250th anniversary, it's a great moment for celebration. 250 years for a free society is no mean achievement. It isn't very long if you look at authoritarian societies like, say, the Egyptian Empire or the Chinese Empire, but free societies are rare, and lasting free societies are rarer still. So it is a moment to celebrate, no question. But I would just point out some of the very obvious crises. I'm an admirer of this country. I'm not American, but certain things are very obvious. First, the most serious is the polarization between those, and we said this, I think, before in your program, those who understand America from the perspective of the American Revolution, largely, but not completely biblical, and those who understand America from the perspective of ideas coming down from the French Revolution. Because things like postmodernism or critical race theory and so on, they're all the heirs of the French Revolution, not the American Revolution. And I would argue they're as much a secession from the American Republic as the South was in splitting from the North in the Civil War. And that has to be resolved. But there's a pushback. Trump represents a huge pushback, but no determined effort to come back and win them back in terms of persuasion and principles, things that you're so concerned with, rightly, Sean.
You hit
That's
on
just an element of the crisis.
Sorry about that. You hit on so many of the key points that we want to discuss, but I wonder if you can explain why it is that like authoritarian regimes seem to last so much longer than liberty-based regimes. And one thing you say in the book is when Moses says, "Let my people go," the Egyptian empire had already existed for about a millennium at that point. So why do secular or authoritarian or regimes, for lack of a better word, tend to last longer than those rooted in liberty?
Because they depend only on power and oppression. Whereas freedom is much more challenging. You take the notion of self-governance or freedom itself, it requires a whole lot of things. So the biblical view of freedom is an ordered freedom that's between the extremes of anarchy on one side, all freedom, no order, and authoritarianism on the other side, all order, no freedom. And as you know, freedom and self independent self-government is a challenging thing for us because freedom always tends to go towards license and do what you like and so on. And freedom is not doing what you like. It's doing what you ought to do if you want
Mm.
freedom to last. And that's much tougher morally, among other things.
That definitely, and that distinction on freedom, we're going to come back to some of that. This, you write, is the second in a 4-part book series that you're working on. We had an interview on your previous book where you talk about kind of our civilizational moment. Will you
Mhm.
remind us what you mean by civilizational moment, and then tell us what makes this book unique?
Well, people use the word civilizational moment like a fancy term for today or the present moment. No, no.
Okay.
Civilizational moment is a moment in the course of a civilization,
Mm,
its rise, flourishing, fall, and decline, when the civilization loses touch with its inspiration, its dynamism. And when that happens, and it happens with every civilization, there are only three broad options: renew the inspiration, replace it adequately, or decline and fall.
mm,
Obviously, the inspiration for West is the Christian faith, or you might say the Christian faith rooted in Judaism, the faith of the Bible. The Bible made the West. So we owe a lot to the Greeks and the Romans, but the Christian faith is essentially the roots of the West. The intended replacement, and as you know, this was the 18th century, was the Enlightenment. Reason, not revelation. Progress, not heaven, and that sort of thing. But clearly, after the 20th century, all the Enlightenment hopes have failed.
mm.
So we're now faced with the thing: there is either a renewal of the Christian faith or the decline and fall of the West. That's the challenge of the civilizational moment we're facing now.
You've shared this before on my program, but I'd love for kind of my viewers and listeners to just kind of get a recap of your life experience that you bring to the table that makes you so concerned about the authoritarian moves that we're seeing take place in culture. If you'd be willing to share that, I think it would give people a real insight and a sense of where you're coming from.
Well, any of you know across the country, if you have friends who grew up, say, in Poland or the Czech Republic or Hungary, in other words, who knew what it was like to live under the Soviets, they're much more realistic. And many Americans are naive. You've been peaceful for so long, and you haven't had any invader in this country since 1812 when the Brits burnt the White House. So Americans don't have a realistic understanding of the horror of authoritarianism. I grew up my first 10 years in China. I was there during the climax of the Chinese Revolution and saw the beginning of the Reign of Terror. And it was genuinely terrifying,
Mm.
rather like the Reign of Terror in the French Revolution. Now, go back to your world, Sean, and my world too, of apologetics. Since Friedrich Nietzsche, in his very last words, the posthumous words in his posthumous book, The Will to Power: do you want a name for my world? This world is the will to power and nothing besides. That's postmodernism. That's the survival of the fittest. That's Xi Jinping. That's Putin. But that's also many Americans. So people who don't try and use principle or persuasion, take Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency. What was
Uh-huh.
the symbol of Doge? A chainsaw. Doge would have been incredible if they'd used American principles with persuasion to show how we need to cut out many of the fat government offices that are grown up. Would have been very important. But just using power, the backlash has been incredible, and it failed. And again, even the conservatives today are using a Nietzschean style power rather than persuasion and principle. And
Mm.
it just shows how far we've drifted from the American Republic.
You have a critique for the left and a critique for the right, which we're going to get to, which is really important that you discuss in this book. But part of what you're saying is there's a root problem that's gone wrong in America. And a lot of our solutions are kind of on the surface addressing them, like your example with Doge. What would you say is kind of the heart of the American crisis?
Well, I think this polarization that I mentioned, because the effect of it is you've drifted. The American Republic, we've got to discuss where it came from. The American Republic is a freedom like no other. That's why I admire it.
Mm,
But you take MAGA, or go back. Joe Biden used to talk of restoring the soul of America. He never said what it was. What's the soul? President Trump talks about make America great again, but he never mentions what made America great in the
mm,
first place. It wasn't the military, it wasn't the economy. America is a nation by intention and by ideas. And those ideas, freedom supremely, are incredibly important. Who defends them? I had an interesting experience with a visit of a group of young people about a couple of months ago, and they were ardent Christians and most of them ardent supporters of the president. And I said to them, all right, what made America great? You support the president? Well, the Jewish Christian foundations, they said. I said, terrific. And what were they? And not one of them could say anything.
mm.
I heard an eminent Catholic leader question about what did the Bible contribute. He couldn't get beyond saying human dignity and worth made in the image of God. I thought, what? Now, many of the things that did come into the revolution came through the Reformation from the scriptures. So our Catholic friends often have a slightly inadequate view. But as Christians and through our pastors, we need people who will tell us what are the biblical foundations for the great truths that made America what it is.
Mm. Well, then let's talk about that. If you were sitting there and these people said, these young people said, we think America, there are certain things that made America great. How would you respond to that question? And maybe tie it in with the phrase that's often used, American exceptionalism. So, talk about if you believe American exceptionalism and some of the biblical, deeper roots of America that you think are so important.
Well, let me be clear. I don't believe in American exceptionalism. One historian put it like this: the really exceptional nation among all the 75 or so superpowers in history would be a nation that didn't consider itself exceptional in its time. In other words, everyone does. Now, of course, every
Mm,
nation is distinctive, every superpower is distinctive.
mm,
You know, take Britain. Britain would have been nothing without the Navy. And as an island with a fleet, the navy and sea power was critical to British supremacy when they controlled roughly a quarter of the world, far bigger than the Roman Empire. Every great nation sees itself as exceptional, and it's true that they're distinctive and unique in some way. But when Americans use the term, they mean almost immune to the run and rules of history. No, no one's immune. So America's not exceptional in any way that's going to be lasting or will keep it afloat unless it lives the way that freedom requires, because America's built on freedom, not power or something else. So you ask, all right, where did it come from? Well, Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, the great French visitor, he said America had a double founding. Obviously, the formal official founders, uh, Washington, Jefferson, Franklin,
mm,
and so on. That's the obvious one. But the other founding, the Puritans. The Puritans. What did they bring? Well, the Puritans were part of the Reformation. And we've got to see here, if you go back to the early church, when Rome declared Rome Christian officially, not Constantine, but Theodosius in 380 AD, the church, wittingly or otherwise, I'll let historians describe,
mm,
copied Roman structures politically. And what were they? Well, Rome had Caesar, consuls, senators. And lo and behold, what did the church have? Popes, cardinals, bishops. Now, Rome was hierarchical, based on the power of ranking, and so was the church. And it was a famous saying by a Catholic layman, Lord Acton, all power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts. He was criticizing in that letter his own church. He disagreed with papal infallibility, for example. But that's what created, and as historians say, all power corrupts, and all power corrupts the powerful, as well as oppressing the weak. So the Reformation said, is that biblical? No. What is biblical? They went back to what the 17th century, after the 16th, called the Hebrew Republic. In other words, the founding of God's nation in
Mm,
Exodus and the renewal of God's nation under Moses, Deuteronomy. The whole of Deuteronomy is the renewal of a covenant. And as you probably know, Sean, in the 18th century, if you look at all the books that were cited, the most quoted was not John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Cicero,
mm,
or something like that. It was Deuteronomy,
mm,
because it was the ideas in Exodus and Deuteronomy that were behind the English Revolution, which failed. It's called the lost cause. And the English Republic lasted 10 years. That's not very long.
mm,
But what was the losing cause in England became the winning cause in New England. The Mayflower Compact is a covenant. John Winthrop's speech on the Arbella was a covenant. Even Jefferson and Franklin, who weren't the most ardent of evangelicals, to put it mildly, when they were asked to produce a seal for the new United States, they both chose a seal from the Exodus and the Red Sea.
mm,
And you could go on down the line. John Adams said, the Hebrews have done more to civilize humanity than any other people on earth. They knew the debt, not to Rome, not to Greece. Yes, they read the Greek and Roman stuff. They knew the debt to the Bible. And the tragedy is you don't hear pastors. I'm not calling for people to politicize their sermons. We don't want political sermons. We want biblical sermons, including the great truths of the Hebrew scriptures that give us human dignity, truth, freedom, justice, peace, all the great principles that made this country in the beginning and need to remake it today.
mm. Connect a couple things for me, Os, if you will, that you were very clear that you don't believe in American exceptionalism, but you're a foreigner and you're deeply concerned about the state of the American Union and you don't want it to fail. So, why do you not want it to fail and have concern for it, but don't believe in American exceptionalism?
Well, I believe in the distinctiveness of the American Republic. Don't misunderstand me. But that exceptional, we're exceptional because of that. We don't follow the run and rules of history and we'll last. No, you won't.
Mm,
America will decline unless there's a renewal in biblical terms, too. So I don't believe in exceptionalism, but I'm a great admirer of the American Republic because it is the closest modern system that is close to the scriptures themselves. And of covenantal systems, there are really only three in history. They're relatively rare. The Jews,
mm,
the Swiss, and the Americans. And of course, the American, as the world's superpower, is more important. Now, I admire it because it's the best counter to the danger of power and the authoritarianism and totalitarianism that's sweeping the world.
mm,
So if America fails, clearly the European nations are not so clear, and they're well down the path of decline, to put it mildly. Even my own nation, Britain, tragically, in the last 10 years, just degenerating before our eyes and denying many of the things like freedom of speech and religious freedom, which the English were in the forefront of pioneering.
mm.
So Europe is in a sad state of disarray. But if America goes too, then there's no real counter to Xi Jinping and his boys.
Okay, so you might have answered the question that I was really wanting to ask you. You're an evangelist and you're an apologist, and yet you're writing multiple books about the state of America. Why so concerned about this republic moving forward? In some ways, you may have just answered that because the domino effects for freedom throughout the world and in Europe. But are there any other reasons why it's so important that at this stage in your life and your career, you're writing and you're focusing on this?
Well, Sean, you're an apologist. I'm an apologist, and I love it. And your dad's a great one, too, and many
Mm,
others who are our friends. What I'm doing is exactly the same, but I'm
mm,
defending human dignity. But I view it all as apologetics, except it's not personal. I love that too. In other words, arguing for the faith to bring people to know the Lord. I love that.
Mm,
This is arguing for the faith in terms of public life.
mm,
Can we create and build and establish and sustain a society that's based on the high principles that are there at the heart of faith?
mm,
You know, freedom is God's gift to humanity. Now, does that mean just you and I have freedom personally, spiritually, so we're saved? That's it? No. It should mean that we have a way of living and a way of living together, as the Bible shows us, where we can be free in a wider way and bring in justice and so on.
mm. What's so unique about 250 years? Is there some historians argue that great nations often survive about 250 years? I've heard this argument. Is there something pressing you, motivating? Do you buy that argument that a lot of nations will last, say, 250 years and then decline, or do you view it differently?
I do view it differently. Those are
Mm,
the cyclical historians who view, rise, flourishing, decline, and fall always in certain cycles. Now, some fasten on 250, the average years in which superpowers have lasted in power. Others take it a little more slowly. Chinese cyclical historians. The Muslims are a little shorter than the Chinese, and it's people like John Glubb in the last century who fastened on to. I don't believe in any of that.
mm,
I don't think biblical history is cyclical. And I love the fact that while the secular pairing is decline and fall, and obviously since the 18th century, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire with Edward Gibbon, that's become the way most Westerners see it: decline and fall. That isn't the biblical pairing.
mm,
I love the fact that the biblical pairing is exile and return, or possible return. In other words, exile, if people don't follow the will of the Lord, the way of the Lord, there are social consequences. Adam and Eve are east of Eden. Cain, a wanderer in the earth. Israel, captive under Babylon, and so on. So the church in deep decline and corruption at times. If we leave the way of the Lord, as America has done now, we're not living the way of the Lord here. We've abandoned things like, say, truth and so on. America will decline. 2 and 2 equals 4. America will decline and fall if
mm,
she leaves the way of the Lord. But the biblical view of exile is followed by return, or the potential of return. Interestingly, most American Christians immediately quote 2 Chronicles 7,
mhm,
if my people. But as you know well, Sean, Solomon didn't follow what he said. He flouted what he was told to be as a king, had too many wives, too many horses, too many inflating monuments. He became a second Pharaoh with conscription and slavery, and the revolt against him in his son's time divided the kingdom forever. Solomon is not the example that we should follow. We should follow Moses and the other prophets. Moses, Deuteronomy 30. If you return to me, says the Lord, and he's predicting exile, even before they got to the promised land, Moses predicts they'll be in exile because they leave the Lord. But he said, if you return to me, I will return to you and restore your fortunes. And you see that in many of the other prophets, right through to Malachi. Now, that's the story of the church. The church often declines. The American church is declining. There's immense amount of, well, look at the mainline churches, they've lost the faith altogether. They are being acculturated into oblivion. And much of evangelicalism is so profoundly worldly, it needs renewal again. But you remember that wonderful, I got the quote from that wonderful quote from G.K. Chesterton. 6 times, and he was looking over the course of history, 6 times the church has gone to the dogs. But in each case, it was the dog that died. Why? Because of revival, renewal, reawakening. And that is our hope, exile and return, if we return to the Lord. So my hope and prayer is that Christians in America next year will examine their hearts, see where we've drifted, spiritually as well as politically, and seek to rededicate ourselves and renew ourselves before the Lord. In other words, we need an Ezra Nehemiah moment, and they saved Judaism.
Okay, so I want to come back in a minute to where you think we've erred politically. You said left or right. But right now, I imagine some people listening are saying, Dr. Os Guinness, this sounds a lot like Christian nationalism. You're saying we need an Ezra. You've also talked about our roots in Deuteronomy, where there's kind of exile and return, and that we need a renewal of our biblical faith. Is this similar to Christian nationalism? And if not, how is it distinct?
Emphatically not. Now, that notion of Christian nationalism was actually an elite notion among the educated who were mostly globalists and therefore against nation states anyway in the name of internationalism. But we got to think it through. I follow the Bible, of course, but George Orwell, who was an atheist, put it very simply: patriotism is good, nationalism is bad. What's the difference? Every human, again, we're back to apologetics, Sean, needs meaning, belonging, and purpose. Now, patriotism answers belonging. We belong to families, we belong to communities, we belong to nations. You guys are Americans. I'm British and Irish. We all belong and we need to belong. Patriotism is being grateful and proud of the place you belong to. Nationalism is idolatrous because it says the place I belong to, right or wrong. So the nation becomes God. Now, that was incredibly dangerous in the 19th century with the rise of nationalism, things like National Socialism, and it became a curse. And so it's understandable people reacted and became globalists, internationalists rather than nationalists. But actually, globalism is the new idol. So we are neither nationalists, we are patriots, but not nationalists.
Mm.
And the gospel is global, but it also speaks to the nation. So we've got to be clear about that. I am not in favor of Christian nationalism, but we've got to remember that that insult is often unfair. It wipes out patriotism too. And patriotism is very important.
That's a great distinction between Christian nationalism and a Christian's love for home, which is a kind of patriotism. I think the way you describe that in the book, and you also say, there's a certain kind of gratitude that comes from a healthy kind of patriotism, a thankfulness of where we come from. I think that's balanced as well. You spoke about England earlier, and correct me if I'm wrong, as if it's either almost gone or gone, and America is kind of following behind it in some sense. So how do we know when a nation, you think, has gone too far and renewal is not possible anymore?
We don't. In other words, we're humans. Only the Lord knows that. And that's why we got to turn to him. I don't know. But at a certain point, people in a declining nation don't turn back to the Lord. And at some point, and I don't know it, I'm a human, there's a point of no return. When we reach that, I don't know. Now, if the Lord tells someone that directly, it's not their speculative guess, I'll listen to them, but I don't know. But the point is, everything in me suggests that this is a providential moment coming up next year. So 250th, on the 200th, if you may not remember back then, John, you weren't the eminent apologist back then that you are now. Your dad was, though.
That's true. I was born in 1776, by the way, the bicentennial
There you
year.
are.
So
That's wonderful. You were the gift of that year. But there was a famous book the year you were born by Robert Bellah called The Broken Covenant. And he analyzed the covenant that came in with the Puritans had gone in all sorts of ways. It had been secularized out of recognition. So the last presidents who talked, Lyndon Johnson talked about our covenant with the land. That's rubbish. We have a responsibility for the land with a covenant with each other under the Lord. Bill Clinton talked about the new covenant, but then he fell foul of moral things. He never gave any explanation of what the new covenant was. It's gone. Here's my point, though. Bella said the covenant is broken. Not a single American leader or pastor that I know of has tried to restore and repair the covenant since then. So 50 years later, the covenant is not only broken, it's been entirely forgotten. And that's dangerous. That's behind the crisis of the Constitution. The progressives want to get rid of the whole thing altogether.
You have a criticism for both the left and for the right politically, and you don't spare any punches and name different presidents. So I'd love to hear your critique. Let's start with the left and then we'll move to the right. What is your concern and the critique for the left today in America?
Well, the problem on the left is obvious. It is the radical critique of cultural Marxism, the so-called long march through the institutions starting in the late 60s. And of course, that has joined forces. What we saw after October the 7th was radical Marxism, the long march, the radical left, joining forces with radical Islamism, which goes back to the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem in 1941, the year of my birth, joining forces with Hitler. Now, radical Marxism, radical Islamism, the so-called Red-Green Alliance, has flourished on American campuses and now increasingly in some of the cities. You take, say, the new mayor of New York. That is the end of the American experiment, if it goes further. So Trump, thank God, represents pushback. But pushback is not return and transformation. That's a much deeper challenge. So I say, thank God for the pushback, getting rid of wokeism. But people who say that wokeism is dead have surely wrong. It is well, alive and well, certainly in the universities and in many of the huge foundations with their philanthropic largesse, people like George Soros. The left is far from dead. And unless the right, or conservatism, more importantly, does it well, there'll be another pushback from the other direction. So to me, it's sad that President Trump has revenge lawfare. Understandably, he was treated abominably, the Russian collusion hoax, et cetera, and all the impeachments. They were abominable. But if he just responds in kind, what happens when he goes? The next side will do the opposite. You'll have ricocheting backwards and forwards, the same problem. You need a Lincoln-style leader who will say to America, we can't be half slave, half free. We've got to resolve this one. Or you put it in biblical terms. We are rather like the Galatians. Paul says, who's bewitched you? You came to faith through one gospel, and now you're following a different gospel. Works, not grace. And I'm saying to America, and not only me, but others too, who's bewitched you? You came to freedom through one revolution, the biblical one, and now you're following another revolution, the French one, which will lead in a completely different direction. You've got to choose.
You're right. That is somewhat of a clear critique coming from the West, the way you described it. I'm sorry, from the left. But what about the right? What's your critique of the right? I don't recall you talking about this as much in your earlier books as you do now. Is that because it's become a little bit more pressing than what it was in the past? So I guess two questions. What's your critique of the right? And do you feel like it's a growing critique we should be more and more concerned about?
No, I've got to be careful here. I admire this country. I have passionate American friends, so I'm not attacking America. Just take first something rather obvious, the way the right, the MAGA movement, is splintering. And you have people like on the extremes, like the more moderates like Tucker Carlson, and then the real extremes like Nick Fuentes. And people who are anti-Semitic and arguing on behalf of Hitler rather than Churchill. and stuff like this. This is abominable coming from the right. Now, let's look, and I'll say it very carefully, with our president. Thank God that he's pushed back against the left. I truly mean that. Thank God. But notice how often he relies on power plays, and his politics is all personalist. It's about him. Those are two very, very dangerous things that are very different. You know, the opening statement of Rick Warren's book on calling, it's not about you.
Mm.
That needs to be said to every American politician. It's not about you. As leaders, you should be servants of the republic, of the people you're leading. And sadly, on the conservative right, that's not happening. And there's going to be a pushback. There will be a pushback. There already is a pushback. No King's Movement and many, many others. There's going to be a pushback because this is not the American republic that the conservative movement's fighting for. Now, Speaker Johnson, he understands that well. One of his slogans is restore the republic. But his voice is very, very rare. Most people are just MAGA without saying what made America great in the first place. And that's the tragedy. It won't succeed without putting back in what made America great in the first place.
So remind us again before we move on, if you were to sum it up, what did make America great in the first place?
Well, let me put it in terms of St. Augustine. You know, he would argue, and put it in modern terms, you don't judge the state of a nation by the size of its population or the throw weight of its missiles or the strength of its aircraft carriers or whatever. You ask what it loves supremely, St. Augustine, and see how that's doing. What does America love supremely? There's no question that the world would say freedom. But America's screwing up what it takes to be a free society. I mean, you take a simple example, which is a matter of neglect rather than malice. For the framers and for the Bible, freedom requires the rule of law, but that's the public expression. It requires the role of character and virtue in private. All the framers said that. I call it the golden triangle of freedom. Freedom requires virtue. Virtue requires faith. Faith requires freedom. It goes round. That's gone. All the framers say that. Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, whether they were evangelicals like Patrick Henry or Orthodox believers like George Mason or deists like Thomas Jefferson, they all believe that. Who believes that today? It's gone. In other words, modern Americans, not just the libertarians, modern Americans have an unrealistic view of freedom. They've lost the biblical and the framers' view. And freedom won't last the way it's being practiced today. It's as simple as that. 2 and 2 will never make 5.
One of the interesting sections that jumped out to me as an apologist is you talk about kind of the three main religious systems or worldviews. So secularism, Eastern religions, which you include New Age, and then the Jewish and Christian faiths. You argue that it's the kind of Judaism and Christianity together that can provide a basis for robust freedom. But why can't secularism or the East in principle, Eastern faiths, provide the basis for a robust freedom?
Well, just take history, Sean. Was there freedom in the ancient world? No. The ancient world was ruled by fate. It was in your stars or whatever it was. You take the Delphic Oracle, you know, Laertes is told his son will murder him and marry his mother. So they do, his parents, Oedipus's parents, do everything they can to beat the oracle. Everything they do makes it all the more certain the oracle comes true. In other words, fate. You can't do otherwise. All other people can do is look with sorrow and pity on someone who's a victim of fate. That's the ancient world. You say, but we're modern. But have you ever thought, I know you have, Sean, all the great atheists, Marx, Freud, Dawkins, Sam Harris, Jacques Monod, there's not one of them who believes in freedom. If you look by reason alone, by science alone, you can't find freedom. They believe in determinism. All the great atheists are determinists. I don't know of a system like the Bible that gives you a strong view of freedom. But God, who's a free God, free in his creation, let there be and there was, creates humans in his image. C.S. Lewis calls us sub-creators rather than creators. God respects our freedom. Even some Christians, they think because of original sin, there's no freedom, the bondage of the world. That's too. You take, say, our Lord's words to Cain. He's thinking of murdering. And the Lord says, sin is crouching at the door. Cain has a choice there. Now, sadly, he goes out, follows his impulses, and murders Abel. But the Lord speaks to him as a free agent who can make a decision in the next seconds that are going to be determined. He does have freedom. Repentance is freedom. It's not as fully free as when we're saved. No, we're well down the line. We may be becoming obsessed or addicted to whatever we're into, whether it's drink or drugs or bad behavior. We may be losing our freedom. We can through addiction by making all bad choices. But repentance is actually the final freedom we still have to turn back to the Lord. So we should be the champions of freedom. The atheists can't.
You know, you're right about that. When you think about people like Dawkins argues, it's kind of a kind of genetic determinism that drives our behavior and drives morality. Sam Harris wrote a whole book on how there's no such thing as freedom. And yet I've been reading Deuteronomy, as you referenced, over and over again for the past maybe 4 to 6 weeks. And one of the key verses is, today choose life to the nation of Israel. You have a choice laid out before you. Now, I imagine a skeptic might say, okay, Os, in principle, they have a choice whether they follow or not, but God lays this kind of draconian rules on top of them and says, if you don't follow this, you'll have pestilence and all this judgment and things will go terrible for you. And if they follow, then in Deuteronomy, things will go well. So they have choice, but is it really any kind of choice when it's just two extremes laid out for them? When Israel was first founded.
But remember, you're obviously focusing on the negative side of judgment, all the dreadful things that happen to them. And the Jews read that every year with incredible awe and trembling. Now, but the point is, judgment in the Bible is not God zapping us, kind of drone strike from on high, like killing of Soleimani on the airport. No. Judgment in the scripture sometimes is that, but more often God's leaving us or driving us to the logic of our own settled choices. If we do certain things will happen. We'll be reaping the harvest. We've sown the wind and we'll reap the whirlwind, and so on. We've got to remember that. It's the logic of our own settled choices. The Lord's just giving them a choice. It's not a threat. He's setting out a choice. And if they want to reap the logic of what it is to leave them, well, for example, Israel's a tiny nation and it lives, Armageddon, in the world between empires, Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, Greece, Rome. And not surprisingly, they are the plaything of these great superpowers. And when they leave the Lord, what do they expect? Their little football kicked around by the superpowers. In other words, the Lord's not saying, I'm going to judge you by that. He does use the superpowers to judge and to liberate them. But if they want to play without him, that's the world they're in. And that will be the same. American freedom left to itself will produce chaos. And the unraveling of America, take, say, school shootings. We've had, tragically, shootings this very weekend.
Yeah.
Again, I've heard people say, all right, more guns. That was the response to the shooting at Brown University. The constant in the American school massacres and the shootings is obviously the gun. The gun is only the how. What's the why? The why is the loner. And you can see so many of them from Columbine on, were people with broken homes and all sorts of things like this who want to wreak their revenge on the school, the society, the neighborhood that they feel victimized them in some way. And so we got to be sure if we leave the Lord, there will be consequences. America will go down in a welter of chaos and corruption.
Hmm. So what
Already
would this
begin in some ways.
So if you were a pastor, what would this look like for you in terms of addressing the area of politics? Because right now churches are just dividing and people are divided and there's polarized internally about supporting this candidate, support that candidate. You have a reference in the book that the pulpit really needs to return to be the place where people speak truth. What advice would you give for pastors and others to approach the importance of the issues you're talking about here without getting what might be considered too political?
Sean, that's a huge question to be towards the end. I would just say very simply, much preaching has been overly privatized and overly politicized. Politics, I love the old saying, politics is not the first thing. And the first thing to say about politics is that politics is not the first thing. So it's not the business of the preacher to tell us how to vote and to get into all the policies. That's politicizing the pulpit. But it is the business of the preacher to go beyond the purely private, bringing us to faith and then seeing we're built up as disciples, to preach the whole counsel of God. And it was the whole counsel of God rediscovered in the Reformation that gave rise to modern freedom, things like covenant that I mentioned. So how many pastors are comfortable in preaching the Exodus and preaching Deuteronomy, not in terms of our contemporary policies, no, but the great biblical truths without which we won't have free societies? Sadly, I haven't heard much of it.
Hmm.
Too much preaching is overly privatized or overly politicized. Would that we had people. I mean, you read a book like, say, Leon Cass's The Founding of God's Nation. There are magnificent truths that should excite pastors to leap up out of their socks. The freedom to preach these great biblical truths. I mean, Exodus alone, it's the master narrative of human freedom for the whole of the West. It's also the greatest sustained critique of the abuse of power the world's ever seen. Why aren't we preaching it today over against the authoritarianism we're seeing?
Hmm.
As we should be excited out of our minds by these great biblical truths.
Hmm. I love that balance between being politicized but also being too privatized. There's a balance there that biblical truths apply to our life and our cultural moment, but we got to go back to the text and preach them fervently. All right,
Yeah.
so let me bring this full circle if I can. We're coming up on this 250th year anniversary of America. What would you like to see happen? What would you prefer that would tell you we're possibly on the road towards renewal?
I would like to see, and this is actually underway, whether it'll come out as we really hope and pray, I don't know, but out of a group of Christians in the House, congressional members, there's come a call to make May the 7th, which is the annual day of prayer, congressionally approved, originally led by people like Vonette Bright and so on, a magnificent day, to make the annual day of prayer next year a day of prayer and national rededication. And at the height of it, and there would be an event on Capitol Hill and local events around the country, at the heart of it, there would be three things. One, thanksgiving. Americans have an immense amount to thank the Lord for. Secondly, confession.
Hmm.
The very ideals of the American experiment, like the Declaration of Independence, are the standards by which America will be judged. And then thirdly, rededication to America's first principles. Now, someone's got to show people what they are. But those three elements, thanks, confession, and rededication. Take confession. You read Lincoln's prayers and confessions. They are magnificent at the time of the Civil War. We've forgotten God and all that that meant. you need a leader today. I mean, there are leaders, and you can know who think that confession is weakness. No, putting right what's wrong is the way to go forward. It's not a question of going back and wallowing in self deprecation, but clearing the guilt of the past to go forward into the future. So forgiveness is incredibly important, and Christians have got to show. Put another way, Sean, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, was for Israel's national sin, the sin of the golden calf. It wasn't just for individuals. America needs atonement. How could the radicals, even after Martin Luther King, twist the knife into America's guilt, particularly the guilt, say, of Southern Christians who had justified slavery? The radicals on the left were able to twist the knife because there is still unaddressed, unresolved guilt in America. Now, I'm English. In England, evangelicals are proud of the fact who were the abolitionists? They were evangelicals. We don't have guilt on our hands. We thank God evangelicals like Las Casas in the 16th century were on behalf of freedom and reform. But here there's a mixed record. There's a lot of guilt. People feel bad, particularly about the South and so on. And so America needs atonement. But is atonement just for you and me and our friends privately? No. Surely there's a place for Christians to lead a day of confession. We're not doing the atonement next year, but I think beyond next year, there's a place for that too. In other words, we've got to take some of these great spiritual truths and make them for America too, we who love the nation.
Well, I have a ton more questions for you, but I want people to pick up your book. So my last question is, in preparation for the 250th anniversary, I would say, obviously, we can be in prayer about this. Your book, America Agonistis, is just a clarion call to think through the cultural moment we find ourselves in. You really encourage not just Christians, but all people to say, what does it mean to be free? Where did our freedom come from? How do we maintain our freedom? I mean, this book is an invitation for the church and beyond at this 250-year benchmark to reflect on that in a way we never have done before. So I encourage people to pick up your book, talk about it, talk with your kids about it. But anything else we should know and do in preparation for this year so we can just respond biblically in this moment?
No, yeah, I think you put it well. Pray, think, see where we slipped, and then learn to bring our apologetics out into political discussion, taking ideas that people have and pushing them to the limit and showing that there's a better story. All the things we do in terms of atheism or Hinduism or Marxism, whatever it is, on the personal level, bringing people to faith, we need to do it. That's what Elijah did to the nation. Up on Mount Carmel, Elijah didn't say, come back to God or Israel's going to fall apart. He said, if Baal is God, follow Baal. How can he say that? Well, he knows Baal is not God. Now, we know that on the personal level apologetically, but I wish Christians would bring apologetics out of the personal and bring it into a public persuasion on all levels. But above all, pray. I believe, I may be wrong, the Lord knows the answer. Humanly speaking, next year could be providential because people are forced to think about it. We mustn't just be content with fireworks and flyovers. Unless there's a serious reflection, serious putting right what needs to be put right, and a return to the best of the American experiment, the days of the Republic are over. Now, that doesn't mean America collapses. No, America could be a democracy in name only, could be a powerful modern nation for a long time. But the Republic, which really was a form of freedom like no other, that will be gone.
If I may, one more question. I would love to hear you just tell me a little bit more what you mean by kind of applying our apologetics in the political realm, because I think people hear that. And I realize this is an entire conversation in itself. We could spend another hour on what this would look like, but maybe just a principle or thought onto what it would look like in your mind to do apologetics well. And the way, in fact, the way you phrased it was kind of arguing for a better story. So it's less about political power, it's less about a political party. It's ultimately about the story of Christianity, as I hear you. But give us some guidelines or principles of what you think that might look like.
Well, take next year and the Declaration. Clearly, the Declaration is the heart of the brilliance of American independence. A book came out last month called The Greatest Sentence Ever Written. What do
Hmm.
they mean? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all, you know the sentence. Certainly, it's a great sentence, the best sentence in the Declaration.
Hmm.
But just take two things. It's not the greatest. I mean, John 3:16 is infinitely greater, but just take what it is. We hold these truths to be self-evident. They didn't follow it. They wrote that and said that and kept their slaves. And that's the original sin of the American Revolution, tragically. And we've got to own up to that. Or take a second part, more logical. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Why did they say that? They would never have been self-evident to Plato or to Aristotle or to the Hindus who have untouchables as well as Brahmin, or to the great captains of history like Alexander and so on. It's an absurd statement. Why is it self-evident? Who is it self-evident to? Only one group, the readers of the Bible,
Hmm.
Jews and Christians. Now, in other words, you've got a very important statement there. Christians can tackle that apologetically. Yes, it's a fantastic statement. Only if you know that people are made in the image of God, the poor as well as the rich, the plain as well as the beautiful, and go on down the line. Only to biblical people, Jews and Christians, is that true. So Americans have an apologetic opportunity, even discuss something that's going to be the most discussed saying of next year.
Hmm.
And we've got to do that across the board with freedom. What we were talking about with our atheist friend, Sam Harris. He has a puppet on the front cover of his book. Why?
That's right.
Freedom of illusion. We are puppets. Figure out scientifically what drives us. We can never do otherwise than we've done. That's not freedom, that's determinism. We have an incredible opportunity. That's what I mean by dealing with these big political issues apologetically. Now, you could call that prophetic rather than apologetic, but I see no difference. It's all seamless to me.
Hmm.
Arguing for truth on the personal level, we'll call it apologetics. On the public level, we'll call it something else, but they're all the same.
Very helpful. I love that distinction and that challenge to kind of seize the cultural moment we're in to talk about the issues that matter most, ultimately to try to be compelling to the story that you and I believe and know is ultimately true. As always, enjoyed the read. It's provocative. It's interesting. It's called American Agonistas. Going to hold up a copy. Just came out. And friends, in light of this 250 years, let's be in prayer for our country. Let's be in prayer for our leaders. A book like this will make you think and reflect upon how unique in some ways America is, and pray for renewal in our country and beyond. Because if you heard today, a lot is at stake. Before you click away, make sure you hit subscribe. We got a lot of other programs like this coming up where we want to challenge and equip you to be an apologist and evangelist and just think biblically about cultural issues today. And we've got a master's program in apologetics online and in person. We'd love to have you think about joining us. Information is below. We also have totally updated our certificate program. If you're not ready for a master's, but you want to learn how to defend the faith, there is a significant discount below in the description. We will see you soon. Again, Os Guinness, thanks for joining me, and I hope folks pick up America Agonistas.
Can I just say it's only on Amazon. I self-published it in order to put out 3 or 4 books fast in 1 year.
So only on Amazon, you heard it, which is why you have a quick turnaround, and so many of the examples seem just incredibly timely and relevant. So well done. Thank you.